So, hi everyone, and good afternoon to all of you. And for this early career researchers webinar series, and I'm extremely delighted to today introduce the speaker of the day, Rinan Shah, and she's been with the ATREE, the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, and Rinan has done her PhD from ATREE, and her areas of interest cover environment and development in the political economic context. And she is currently studying the manifestation of domestic water scarcity in urban mountain towns of eastern Himalayan region. I think the area where she comes from. And she was also a research fellow under the National Mission on Himalayan Studies, and she has also been contributing author, which is a very prestigious task that she was involved in. That is the IPCC Group 2-6 assessment report, that 6AR report, which you guys must have seen. And she is also a member of the Indian Youth Water Network. And she has kindly agreed to share with all of us today her experience and her work on understanding water consumption and sufficiency in urban mountain towns. And I think perhaps some of the examples she will be sharing with you is from the Darjeeling town where she comes from. So I think with this, without further ado, I think over to you, Rinan, and thank you very much for accepting our this request and being here with us today this afternoon. So over to you, Rina.
Thank you, Dr. Sikta, and everybody at IWMI for giving me this opportunity. I'll just start share my screen now. Can you see it?
I think yeah, it is there. Please.
Okay. As Dr. Sikka mentioned, I have been studying domestic water scarcity and manifestation of it in the Eastern Himalayan region, particularly in Darjeeling. And this presentation, I will be drawing from parts of my PhD thesis to present my work here. And the first line that I have used in this presentation means is Garnai Paryo, Milaunai Paryo, which in Nepali, it means we have to make do, adjust and manage with what we have. And this is one theme that emerged out of the lives and livelihoods of people dealing with domestic water scarcity in Darjeeling town. To begin with, I would like to show you a picture of what the Eastern Himalayan region in India looks like. It's considered one of the biodiversity hotspots, also having the highest per hectare water availability as well as per capita water availability. However, what has happened is that it has the narratives around a lot of water and the Himalaya in general being called the water towers of the world has created a pervasive imagery of water abundance, and they are known as water towers of the world. However, water injustice mostly at the local levels in terms of where the households get their access to water from, which is majorly springs, has been obscured in the marginalized mountains. And I say the mountains are marginalized in various aspects, such as environmental. In terms of the mountains, the Himalayas are one of the youngest mountains in the world, and they are in high seismic zones. They are economically marginalized because a lot of there isn't quite there is a kind of development that has led to underdevelopment where there's not much finances being reinvested into the region. Politically marginalized in terms of representation at the local, national, as well as international levels. And geographically too, because what we have also seen is distance from administrative centers are one of the determinants of marginalization. Hence, the mountainous regions face a kind of conundrum or paradox. This is one thing which I have looked at one of my papers, which is published in the Water Policy Journal, where the mountainous regions faces a conundrum because of the biophysical characteristics, the social features, the political economy of the region, and the institutional structures. Sorry. Water scarcity studies have moved on, so to say, from being studies that were, mostly which were only focused on management, engineering, economics, to ones to it moved forward to look at aspects of socio-cultural differences as well as institutional and discrepancies and inefficiency. Hence, scarcity is neither natural or nor universal, and how water scarcity is interpreted by the different parts, by the different bodies of the government or even the people or the communities, that affects how the different schemes are introduced. Mostly water scarcity studies have also not so much looked at the translation of availability of water into accessibility, and scarcity has been seen as a pre-existing problem, and then solutions, or first you say that establish that there's a water scarcity, and then you move on to suggest how people have coped with it, how are they dealing with it. Whereas there have been quite a few less studies on how the scarcity came to be at what it is. In order to understand water scarcity, indicators have been used primarily, and these indicators primarily they use aggregations, which misses out on the geographic as well as economic differences, as well as the temporal and spatial nature of water flows. As I mentioned, they fail to look at the process of how the rainfall or snow or glacier, however the water sources are, into accessibility at the household level. And what this does is it misleads categorizations, creating the categorization of sufficiency, scarcity, security, stress, and which affect policies for water elevation. Thereby creating a paradox in policy prescriptions. Springs, as we know, which majority of the Hindu Kush Himalaya as well as the other mountains in the world depend upon. In India, they were only recently recognized at the national level. That was in 2018 when a report was created by a group of scholars and researchers in India. We've also seen that there has been underinvestment in water infrastructure, and where engineering solutions, where you have big water, pumping up water from rivers or drawing water from hundreds of kilometers away as the only way forward, which unfortunately have had very low success rates. And the low success rates of such large projects, as well as the low success rates of such projects have led to the emergence and predominance of informal water institutions, which I've also explored in detail in one of my papers, which I have published in the Himalaya Journal, as well as a conference proceeding. In order to, for my thesis, this was the larger framework that I used to understand water scarcity, where I began with the biophysical aspects to understand, is there enough water or not? So that was my first question. And then moved on to look at infrastructure investments and institutions, which I also call the 3 I's of water infrastructure, water and governance. And then I moved on to look at the access, which are determined not only physical access, as well as institutional access in terms of how communities do or do not gain access to water resources. And lastly, looking at entitlement failures. This is how my larger thesis is structured, but I have, it might come online soon. For this work, I will only be focusing on household analysis, but I will of course be drawing from what I have done, what I've studied in the biophysical as well as the institutions and investments. Household water scarcity, when I began the work, we saw that household water scarcity are defined in objective terms and norms based, which are usually defined in terms of liters per capita per day as to how much volume of water a household gets. Or you have aspects of perception-based studies where you ask households, you inquire of them of their experiences, their perceptions, and their definitions of sufficiency. And both of these terms have been used by different kinds of research, and even I think even the national NSSO survey do use to a certain extent the perception based aspects of looking at sufficiency, but if do not look at the volumetric. So mostly in one case is one or the other happens, and in my work I've tried to use both of this, and trying to see how one is important for the other, and how the both needs to be understood in terms of understanding household water scarcity. And this is a work in progress, and I hope that I can get it out soon. In addition to the perception, in addition to the volume as well as the perception of households, all of this and the household water scarcity is also defined by infrastructure of the larger infrastructure that is either provided by the state or informal infrastructure, but also the physical infrastructure of the household level, the size of the house, whether the size of the house and where it's located, the physical and socioeconomic characteristics of the household, whether you're located in an informal settlement, whether you're located in the center of the city or the periphery, upper town or lower town, as well as political economic dissimilarity. Most of the poorer households, I think this is a pattern that is across the developing world. Poorer households lie outside of the formal network, and they tend to access informal water or private water supplies, which is also said, which also means that the poorer households are paying more for water in terms of the absolute absolute payment, also, but also in terms of the a proportion of the income. So they usually end up paying more than the households who are higher up the socioeconomic ladder. And because of the households being located outside the formal network, they have to access multiple sources to be able to create a basic amount of water supply. And what basic usually is defined as is the 135 liters standard water requirement, which is defined by the World Health Organization. And this is something which we will break down through the presentation. So 135 liters, if you can see, it is divided into all these aspects of bathing, using in the toilet, washing, cleaning house, washing dishes, and drinking and cooking. So we see that drinking and cooking use the least amount of water, and the other waters are mostly used for major household activity. And in my case of Darjeeling, we will see later is how households negotiate between the different kinds of usages that come from the different kinds of usages for themselves, and negotiate around low water volumes. It has also been said in the case of what the 135 liter per capita per person per capita per day is also where the majority of the water is used to flush your drainage rather than for consumptive uses. So higher portion of it is for non-consumptive uses, and lower portion of it is for consumptive uses. And the standards, if we look at the different standards that has been introduced in India across years, the first three, as you see, even for the urban areas, it depends on where the households are located. If you have a planned sewerage, you have more LPCD requirement. And interestingly, they've also said that urban water areas who collect from standposts require only 40 LPCD. The public standposts most often overlap with households which are in the lower socioeconomic region, and this also shows how the LPCD ranges across where a person is located and who quote unquote has access to higher volumes of water. Even between the metros and the non-metros, there is some difference. And going down to the government of West Bengal, which is where Darjeeling, where my field site is located, they have mentioned 49 as their baseline. This is not an assured amount, but it's considered as the baseline. Recently, the Ministry of Jal Shakti did announce that 135 LPCD was the way to go for the country. Looking at do the households even get 135 LPCD in India, and the answer I think is a clear no. Most of them get less than or almost 50% of what it is. Here I would like you to focus on these highlighted aspects, where you see in Chennai and New Delhi the difference between the peripheries and the prime residential areas. So all these plays out into how much access, what people have access to, and where you're located becomes a driving factor for how much water you're getting access to. In Darjeeling, interestingly, the urban LPCD was shown by studies to be less than the rural LPCD. Yeah, and it has a targeted LPCD of 70. For my work, I did my pilot visits. I began my work in 2014 and did my primary field work between 2018 and 2019. I think you've already guessed by now that my work is focused on the Darjeeling Hills, with Darjeeling municipality in particular. Geographically, it lies in the eastern Himalayan region, and it's said to receive a rainfall of 2,500 to 4,000 mm, and in extreme years, it goes up to 6,000 millimeter. Darjeeling was established as a colonial town in the 1850s, and that was how, and it was also around that time in the late 1800s and early 1900s that the water system came into being, the municipality water system. It also, then a lot of population started coming in because of it being a sanatorium, because of the investments in tea and Cinchona, as well as being a recruitment center for the British Army. For Darjeeling and Kalimpong, the two hill districts within the state of West Bengal, the struggle for a separate state has been going on for more than a century. And this has led to the creation of the territorial administration, adding an extra layer of administration in the usual three-tier administration system that is there in India. So the administration also what it does is it breaks up certain institutions, and sometimes also creating fragments between how the implementation is done, execution is done, and the final supply is done. So that kind of differences also occur, which I have explored in the other papers, but here I'll only be focusing on the household aspect of it. And Darjeeling is also seen as has a history of multiple disruptions, with a lot of political agitations and long strikes happening in between, which is and they do face challenges because of the different bodies of water that are involved in doing the bulk transport, doing the distribution, managing supplies, and so on and so forth. And the presence, absence, or negligence of the state is evident in the region, because most of the remedies are stopgap measures and also do not see the full completion. Around 13 projects have been sanctioned post-independence, out of which only 1 or 2 have been fully functional at the moment. And the chart here shows the access in terms of the formal here, I mean the municipality, and the informal are any other sources. So I would include springs here as well as private suppliers. So only 15% of the households, this is a positive estimate, because while carrying out my study, we have also found that it could be as low as 7% also. So the majority of the households then we see are seeking out for water sources which are outside the formal systems. So you see the top two, one is the municipalities, means these are the different water sources of Darjeeling. You have the municipality, and these are the public taps. You have springs. So springs could either be community springs or it can be private springs. And private springs mostly, could fall under private suppliers, because they supply water for money, for profit in the town. Within private water suppliers, interestingly, I went in thinking that they might be, as the literature said, and what we had seen, that there were only like 4 or 5 different kinds of suppliers. But when I went into the field, there were so many different suppliers that the kind of water suppliers were changing from as I moved from one household to the other. Here in this image, you can see a rainwater harvesting. You can see mini trucks, which have almost like 4,000 liters of water. And then you have bigger tanker trucks, which have 6,000 liters of water. Both of these cost the same. It's just that, places where the big trucks can't go, the smaller trucks go. So which means that they are making water, taking advantage of the terrain that exists in the hills. People also draw water from jhoras, or small streams. Some not 100% sure how clean they are. A lot of private water suppliers drawing water from directly, some households directly draw water from the forests, or you have a middleman who makes the connections for you, who collects the water and then supplies it further to the households. Then you have the hand-drawn carts, and you also have the cantonment. There are two big cantonments within Darjeeling town, and both these cantonments act as pseudo municipality systems where they collect royalty from around the households and allow them access to the sources that exist within the compound. As I mentioned, that the households in Darjeeling do not, only 15% are dependent on formal water supplies. And in my study also showed that most of the sources were private water suppliers. And even if you depended on a municipality supply, you always had a secondary or tertiary source that you kept as a buffer to draw water from. So as I mentioned, you have two cantonments here, one towards the north and one towards the south. The south is at a higher elevation, and it slopes down as you move towards the north. Your water supplies for Darjeeling usually is outside the town. So the municipality also gets its water from the Sinchal Wildlife Sanctuary, which is outside the town. The tankers also get their water from outside the town, but smaller water supplies usually get water, from the forests and springs within the town. So the north, evidently it's farther away from many of the water sources. So the north does not have predominance of municipality supplies. So there was a clear segregation between the north, center, and south. And I would also mention here that in the mountains, the altitudinal aspect also comes into place. So the areas that you see here are at a higher altitude, and the areas towards your left and your right are sloping downwards. So the water sources also changes as we move down the slope. For here, I'm just looking at the north, central, and south. The north primarily had water tankers and big water tankers that were bringing water from outside the town. In the center, we had the most dense municipality sources, and some springs, and all the hand-drawn carts were located within the center of the town, and mostly at the same level, that is in the bazaar area. And towards the south, there was a different kind of sources, such as you had households who were drawing water from the forest themselves, which wasn't there in the central area because there are no forests that they can draw their water from. So households, even within these regions, so I think this is a kind of 2D mapping of how water sources change within these three areas, but even spatially, even altitudinally it changes. And lastly, depending upon the household characteristics. So these three different factors affect to how your water bundles change and what access you have to different sources, and what the sources you have access to also then also determine how much of water you have access to. So moving on to how much water do the households get? Looking at, I had a questionnaire, household questionnaires of around 150 households. We saw that only 8.5% of the households had above 135 LPCD. That's considering the WHO standard. And of the remaining, there were none that fell between the bracket of 80 to 135 LPCD. Everybody else received below 80 LPCD, which seems to be going in line with the other cities of India. However, the only 22% met the standard that was set by Darjeeling municipality, which was 70 LPCD, and according to the West Bengal standard, they were around 22% less than the basic drinking water, and 67% less than the baseline. Among all these, it wasn't equally spaced out. Not many people everybody was getting a good amount of water that was closer to above 40 LPCD or so, because we had a lot of households, around 27 households from a sample who received water around only 7.5 LPCD or less. 7.5 LPCD has been determined to be the lowest amount of water that is required for decent human life. This number is considered very low. Even I had numbers lower than this, and for me it was a challenge because I had to understand what was there in the literature, also understand the scientific reasoning behind the number, and also had to convince or discuss it with my doctoral committee members to see how how could they be living with such less volumes of water, and probing in more on the focusing more on these households who use very less water, we saw that many of them were dependent on rainwater, which is seasonal. On a side note, all households depend on rainwater. So all households have their rooftop rainwater harvesting system, ingenious methods. So all the rain that flows into Darjeeling houses, everybody stores rainwater, depending upon, as long as they have the infrastructure to store it, some space to store it. And many of the households also do in situ usage, where you have seasonal springs, and you go to the source to use it. And they go to the source to use mostly, heavy water consumption activities such as bathing, washing your hair, or washing clothes, etc. And in terms of how they use water, most of them reuse water till the extent that it is no longer fit for any household water use. So you'll wash the vegetables, and then you'll use the water to rinse your clothes, and then rinse your water, and then finally, flush it down the toilet. A lot of houses used shared toilets and public toilets, which also meant that, they had lesser water consumption. Low water consumption activities, as I mentioned, drinking, cooking, and uh, small bathroom activities were done at home. But even from there, high water consumption activities such as bathing and washing were done weekly, or they budgeted their usage across weeks. Some of the students who stay in Darjeeling also pack off their clothes and send it home every other weekend, because many of the tenants, many of the landlords, and that's also an important component, whether you're a tenant or a house owner, because tenants, many young tenants, many school going or college going tenants get houses which do not have water supply. So they will just tell you, we'll give you the house, but you have to manage the water yourself. As when I began, I talked about the objective and subjective ways of using water, water availability, defining household water scarcity. What we saw that when households define their primary sources, its volume is not the only factor that they mention. Sometimes when we say that, is the municipality better? So people have different ways in looking at, whether resource is primary for you or not, and whether it is good enough for you or not. And some of the factors are quantity, distance, perennial nature. Also the one interesting aspect is also awareness of the source. So if you talk about tankers, many people did get water from tankers, but did not consume tanker waters because they didn't know where the water was coming from. However, springs which they saw around the region and they fetched their water themselves, they considered that more potable. But still, we still have, I unfortunately in my work, I couldn't look at the quality aspect. So we don't know if actually there exist some differences in quality or not. Further asking them about, how they have been living with low water volumes, how their experience have been with water. They did talk about feelings of discomfort, tension, stress, and anger during the dry season, especially because the water scarcity is throughout the year, but it gets worse during the dry season. And everybody budgets their water. And usually when they say people who come from the plains, they're usually nervous to have people from the plains because they say, they use water like anything. And this is not only even for plains people, like even if somebody like me who has been living outside goes back home, or goes to somebody in the mountains, they will be quite wary of my water use. What this has done has also created a behavioral aspect in the communities living there, mostly women, because they are the ones who have to not only acquire water but also ration it for usage. They said they have become so trained in budgeting their water that even when there is enough water, they are habituated to using less. So and then they have the tankers. When they peep into the tankers and see where it is at, they are all can always tell how many days where the water they can how much water they can use for how many days. They also have made some observations about how the Western toilets tend to consume more, so households reuse water for that. And lastly, they say many of the households said they have to manage with what they have and they do not complain, which in a way also highlights the lack of any state push for water access, also in terms of some kind of grievance redressal, looking at water in general, because the grievance redressal is always is attached to the municipality. So if you don't have a municipality connection, you'll not be able to complain anywhere. Coming to my conclusions for this chapter in particular, but for this paper in particular, we saw that the private water suppliers were the major water suppliers in Darjeeling town, and water availability only 80% had up to around 80 LPCD, and 91%, and water availability went as low as 7.5 LPCD. We saw that house ownership, location, storage, location in terms of center periphery, but also altitudinally affects the water bundle and the water availability that you have. For households, volume is not the only indicator of good water supply and source, and there are different factors such as quality, distance, number, whether it's a public source or a private source, and so on and so forth. Now, households cope to stressful situations by adjusting with whatever they have. Avoid high water consumption activities, and so much so that some of the households always also resort to using contaminated water. Overall, looking at the framework of water scarcity, the objective and subjective have to be looked at together, because on the one hand, you will have to ensure there is a volumetric sufficiency, and secondly, also contextualize to gather experiences regarding water scarcity in the region. People's experience also also in a way reveal the extent and the duration of which this normalization process of water scarcity has been going through. And low water availability and consumption levels, which are far below the defined scientific norms, seem to have been normalized in Darjeeling town. Lastly, I would like to I was just going through my Google alerts, and this was as recent as 18th May, where water has always been a problem, and water still is inaccessible depending upon who you are, where you're located. Bundelkhand has been facing water crisis for years, but the water crisis emerges in different forms every time you try to look at it. In this case, we have seen how our water quality is becoming an issue in many of the regions across India. Thank you.
Thanks, Rinan, for a very nice presentation. So Dr. Sikka is another meeting, so I'll be hosting the question answer session.
Okay.
So I can see two questions from Shreya. If Shreya can be unmuted, she can ask the questions.
Hi, Rinan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Rinan, I've been wanting to see your PhD for a while now, mostly because I like the idea of negotiating the idea of scarcity in traditionally so-called water abundant areas, because I think for a very long time our policy frameworks have been sort of bound by this conceptualization of water scarce areas and water abundant areas. And as soon as you talk about water abundant areas, it's almost as if they don't need water policies. So that's why I thought it was very interesting. But I wanted to understand a little bit on these two questions. One was, of course, because I've been working on household water access for a while. And what has always been tricky is how do you actually ascertain the actual household water consumption? At best, you would get an estimate if you really break down, into the various activities that utilize water. Or the other option is if you actually have access to metered connection information. That's one. The other one was, did you actually look at what axis of inequality may exist in the household water distribution and access? I'll tell you where this question comes from is that my experience in peri-urban areas has shown that even so-called formal water supply is not entirely. There's a lot of informal bundles of technology, such as, people would put a motor with a pipeline and, have overhead tanks, etc., to essentially for rich households who can afford more powerful motors and can, sort of afford that entire bundle of technology required to convert erratic water supply from from the municipality or the panchayat into 24-hour supply for the households. And because even though this 135 LPCD is actually an average value, right? So there's a lot of discrepancy between those who get water first, those who get water later, and if the water is already finished off by the richer households, then sometimes poorer households don't get it. So did you look at some of these aspects of inequality in Darjeeling, where I'm sure, like I said, even location or slope or something could also make a difference, but I'm sure there would be other social axes of inequality. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the question. I just looked online again today to see if my thesis was available. We're still taking time to upload it on Shrot Ganga. So I hope it'll be there available soon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so for me, I looked at household water availability. So I was looking at how much water they were be able to collect, not as much as looking at how much water was being consumed. So I think there's a difference that comes in, and looking at water availability as how I worked around it. So consumption was something which I haven't measured in this, and availability was used as a, as a, what do we say, as a replicate for consumption. So I did not use consumption, a certain consumption directly. But I think I have tried to look at how much water they get from each source, how often they get water. So mostly looking at the different sources, different volume and frequency, and then I did the calculation to come up with the LPCD number. In terms of inequality of water distribution and access, I think the big first thing for Darjeeling is, who even does have access to infrastructure. As I mentioned, only 15% have access to the infrastructure, and the rest 85%. And this is a very positive estimate. So even within the 15% that have access to water, yes, there are differences between where we are located. The center periphery differences exist, and you have as you mentioned, there are some places which receive 24/7 water supply, some places which are farther outside the town which receive much lesser. So, and also some people have described how, if you lie between where you lie on the pipeline also affects how much water you get. For my work, most of the households that I had municipality supply, it always tended to have almost similar kind of volume. But what was more interesting was, there were some households which were closer to the water tank, and they used to say that, I can simply just go and ask them for water. So that kind of differences came in. And because for me, I thought focusing only on the municipality did not address my question of water access and distribution. So I looked at the larger aspect of, where the other households were getting their water from, and why were households not able to access municipality. So the municipality connection is around 17,000 rupees just for the connection. So, and you'll require 3 documents from the government and a lot of clearances, and there's a waiting time of 5 to 7 years. So one level of exclusion and inequality already comes in the way the municipality is devised to provide access or not, and then we can further look at differences within them. And so I have also been told that tap water or municipality water in Darjeeling has moved on to become a luxury item rather than it being a basic necessity. I hope that answers some of your questions, some parts.
Thanks. That's interesting.
Thanks, Rinan. I'll next ask Monoranjan Ghosh to ask his question.
Archishman, there are some things in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thanks. It's a very good, nice presentations. And I also basically work in the Himalayan foothills, particularly focusing on the district Jalpaiguri and Alipurduar. So I work on the climate vulnerability and adaptation part. But my questions to you two is related to maybe it's theoretical, that you mentioned the mountain marginality, and I love the concepts of mountain marginality. But so I'm basically a native of plain area, but when I visit the mountain area, particularly in the Darjeeling Himalaya or maybe the Bhutan Himalayas and other region. So I found, an ICMAT study also found that in Indian Himalayan regions that the overall poverty rates in the mountains are relatively low than compared to the plain areas. If you visit Bihar or some parts of Uttar Pradesh, even in Maharashtra, there is intense poverty is there. But in mountains, people have ecosystem services. People are using those natural resources and others. And that's my question is the mountains is always this marginal because of its geographical locations and that the concept of distance and others, because it's far away from the so-called the core or the growth centers of the country. And how will define that's the mountain marginality when mountains have a lot of abundance of natural resources and other kind of opportunities also. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think I think you were mentioning the economic mountain marginality, and I think this is a question that would be very particular to Darjeeling Hills, rather than it could be applicable to other parts of the mountains also. But what we have seen in terms of in terms of how the revenue generation happens and how much investments you're getting back into the region in terms of in terms of when I simply look at water infrastructure and see how much the problem is being accepted and how much investments are being into the region. So mostly in terms of whether the region is able to get enough economic economic reimbursements in a way into the kind of revenue it is generated, especially considering tea, which is the largest largest economic not it is a source of income. Tea makes up the economy, but who is getting the money out of tea is also the question. So maybe if we look at the amount of income or the amount of contribution tea is making to the region, it might be large, but is the tea money is the tea money directly or indirectly through investments, through infrastructure, through development schemes is being made into the region? So that is what I meant by economic marginality.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Rinan. Next is Mansi. Mansi, if you can unmute and ask your question. Hello, Mansi. Okay. Probably Mansi can hear. Manish, if Manish can be unmuted. Manish, you can kindly ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, Achusman, thank you. Hi, Rinan.
Hi.
Great presentation. The question would be, and a comment along that would be that a lot of discourse in the Himalayas around the water is along the quantity lines, where how much water people have and so on and so forth. One of the things that you mentioned that people are using and reusing water every time so that they can make do with that small quantity begs the question of how do they perceive quality and how do they or do they factor in that at all when they're using, because the scarcity is so much that there's no quality aspect inside their mind when they're looking at water.
So I think the question is, how strict the conditions are, how conforming the constraints are that you might have to resort to ways in which you have to use and reuse water. I think many times, so the water usage, it also moves down the kind of, I think, it changes, the kind of uses change. So if you're using the water first for washing in the kitchen, the second use will then move to the bathroom or washing your clothes, which you can make do with a little, because it's still soapy water, or water that have removed that your vegetables water from washing your vegetables can be used in soaking your clothes and further on used into the toilet. So the consumption, and people are very particular about what water they consume. So firstly, there's an understanding of spring water being pure. So I think that's another thing we need to talk about. But also people do regularly switch their water. So they have a concept of Basi water or stain water, right? like water you have collected today, you might not consume the water 3 days later, but use it for. So there is an understanding of, freshness of water, pollution, and everybody boils their drinking water. So for consuming, people are, have pay utmost care to. But the waters that are non-consumptive, mostly cooking and drinking is what people boil water and use it, and use fresh water. And the others, so the staler your water gets, the the water kind of water activities you do flow into the other different household activities that you need. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rinan. Then there was a question from Dhaval, if he can be unmuted. Dhaval, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So hi, excellent presentation. I mean, it was really interesting to hear about urban water supply in the mountainous cities. I just wanted to point to one observation that you made during the presentation about how altitude or the elevational difference plays a role in shaping water supply, especially in these cities. So I was just thinking if it helps you to think about urban water supply in a different way in such geographies, like, because it's not just about horizontal flows here, like through pipelines, but also elevational difference. So like, how it shapes supply. And also given that it also disrupts the surface and subsurface water flows, because what was subsurface for some time in the form of emerges in the form of a spring and becomes surface water supply through pipes. So did you kind of encounter this differently through your study? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think for me, one thing is, not only even looking at water sources in urban mountain towns, but even questions that emerged is how is urban in the mountain cities. So questions of not only water supply, but also urbanization was thrown up during the work as to, because Darjeeling is a class 1 city under the census, which only looks at population. So do we also need to rethink how we define urban is one thing that also came up. And yes, about it's very interesting about how, the springs and subsurface become surface flows because they are being converted from sources which are groundwater to something which is flowing through the pipes. Yeah, that is something which I haven't looked, but I did observe because everybody depends on springs, even if you're a private water supplier, even if you're the state, formal water supplies, everything they drink depends on spring water. And that is an interesting way of looking at it. And springs, households depend on springs directly also. So they go and fill water to the springs. What also it does is then it defines how, where you want to live. Because you either,
Right.
living in a place which has close to a spring, but the spring, another aspect is the spring, which has been, which has gotten this halo of common property resource. It doesn't quite work that way. So even if you are located probably close to a spring, you do have to follow the rules that are set up by the community there. So
Right.
gaining access to spring water, even directly or indirectly through pipes, is a lot of different interactions come into the picture. But thank you for the subsurface water flow in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rinan. I had 2 questions. So once again, thanks for a great presentation. So I was curious, did you find seasonal variation in terms of water scarcity, especially in relation to there are tourist seasons? Was there any relationship with that, like the dynamics of that in terms of water scarcity? And the second one, although you mentioned that you did not look into consumption as such, water consumption, but still, did you have any indication in the terms of within household differences in water availability? Like, if you can throw some light?
Yeah, for your first question was on seasonality, right? The seasonality, it gets reflected. The seasonality, if you simply look at the water, it gets reflected in terms of the municipality water supply because it changes during the dry season. And the springs also change. You know, some springs dry up completely, some springs dry to a certain extent. So water sources themselves are also changing seasonally. And whenever the water sources are the driest, is also the tourist season. So yes, there is an overlap, and tourism is also one thing I didn't look at, but I have I have done some preliminary work on understanding, how the floating population affects water increasing demand. So there is a high demand, and it of course overlaps with the dry season. But and additionally, the pattern of tourism is also changing. Initially, people who used to come only during the summers, now you will have tourists throughout the year, and we have chock-a-block tourists even during New Year's, even in extreme cold season. So I think that will be now an additional aspect to look at, because the tourism is changing, which means the water access to water sources might also be changing in a big way. And yes, there are cases of tankers getting kidnapped in the middle of the way by hotels for which were for example, if the tanker was coming to your house but it just disappears midway because it goes to hotel. And hotels, many of them are located in the upper. Darjeeling has an area called the VIP wards, higher up in the mountains, so like closer to Chaurasta and all that. So those hotels also fall in prime locations. So many of them mostly could be getting water more than the others. So, but I haven't looked at that. And about the water within household, I haven't looked at within household, but mostly they did mention how if I had done some work in Gangtok also, where they do mention like consumption patterns of even food like leafy vegetables, that you can't consume leafy vegetables because it takes too much water to wash. Within the household, maybe I think it will be interesting to look at, because only people who might be staying back in the house would only be like the house homemakers, or if anybody stays. Yeah, that would also throw light on how much water is being consumed during the day, because half the time you're out. So yeah, I hope that answers.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll check if Mansi is here. She can unmute and ask her question. Okay, I don't think Mansi is there. If anybody else has, there's a question, anonymous attendee. Rinan, can you?
Yeah, I can read it. Thanks so much. I'm curious to understand the demand for drinking water from springs in urban mountain areas work in relation to hydropower generation for larger urban areas in India. I'm thinking how in terms of towns like Kalimpong can be reached following the Tista River, but the river is also dammed in several places. So for the mountains in Darjeeling, there was no water coming from the rivers, mostly coming from the springs, which eventually flows down to the rivers. That's one thing. But the river water being used, river water being tapped for usage only happened recently in 2015, where they did a river lifting scheme from the Balasan River. And Balasan falls on the other side of Balasan does not. It flows from the tea states and goes into sorry for my ignorance, goes into the plains, and there might not be hydropower, but in Kalimpong, and Kalimpong also doesn't draw water from directly from the Teesta. Kalimpong draws its water from the Neura Valley, which is on the other side, Gorubathan, and side closer to Bhutan. So I think it depends on and Mount and Kalimpong. I know that they draw water from Neura Valley, and the river is almost like 100 kilometers away. But the water, I don't know of the current situation. But as I mentioned in the beginning, the mountain communities rarely depend on rivers directly for their water. So when questions of hydropower and all that come in, they are a different challenge altogether, because hydropower is made when it happens on it does when yeah it hydropower creation on rivers, consumption of water might be affected in places which are closer to the regions, but directly they don't directly conflict with the sources of water in especially for Darjeeling, because there's no hydropower interlinkages interactions happening in Darjeeling. Yeah, I hope that answers. But I think hydropower is a different question altogether, and we might have to rethink a little about that. I might have to rethink.
Priya, if you can unmute yourself, or is it?
Yeah, no, just a little addition to that power question, Rinan. I know that it's been probably not something that's been looked at, but so a lot of the ROR projects that have now proliferated across the Northeast, which essentially entail building tunnels through the mountains. We had heard some narratives, and these are entirely narratives. I'm not sure whether there is enough scientific basis on it. That the tunneling processes around hydro had actually affected the spring flows. So a lot of the villages which were upstream or just above the tunneling regions had lost water sources, the natural water sources. So it might be something into at some future point, but that's just an experience from Sikkim that we came across a lot, that villages had started to complain about natural things which have completely dried up since the hydropower construction. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, yes, that is quite possible, because there have also been instances when in some places in Sikkim where an earthquake of high magnitude or even an average magnitude did lead to the disappearance of some sources. So, I mean, if natural earthquakes are creating issues for water sources, infrastructure, massive infrastructure and intensive infrastructure, which requires a lot of, what do we say, infractions into the system might be creating issues. And I think what one other corollary we can take from that is also how infrastructure within the towns itself, small infrastructure. There have been instances where small infrastructure, for example, if a building is being constructed upstream of a spring, they have led to damages or changes in water quality of the spring. So infrastructure creation within the recharge area has any kind of infrastructure has led to the disappearance of springs as well as changing in quality. And disappearance of springs, in addition to these the biophysical changes which is happening, also the infrastructural changes, but also privatization by households, because as we know, springs come under the rent law, and if you own the land, you own the water. So, and not everybody is gracious enough to give away the water for public usage. So springs are also decreasing in number because of the privatization that happens in many cases.
Okay, thanks, Rinan. I think we're also just on time.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you for this for this great presentation and work on a very complex topic. I'll not try to summarize. So, but thank you, and thanks all of you for attending. We'll share the details of the next ECR's webinar with all very soon, and hope to see you all in the next webinar. Thanks all of you. Bye.
Thank you all for making time. Thank you.